Good evening, everybody. Sorry, I've always wanted to do that. Anyway, it's Jack from Noobminster, back again with the third part on the Constitution. Now, there's been a couple of other videos on the Constitution that I've done. Please go back and check them if you haven't seen them, because otherwise this won't make a lot of sense. There's probably links to it either here, maybe down here. I'm not really sure. I'm a bit new at this, but I'm sure if you poke around the page, you'll find them. But yeah. If you have seen them, 10 mega points to you. Well done. Let's get cracking.
Blah, 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 blah. Noobminster.
I'm sure you've noticed by now that weird thing that the Daily Mail have got going on with their front page, where one day a glass of wine is being held up as the secret to a disease-free and long life, while the next day it turns out that it can kill a man stone dead. Well, it turns out that politics is no different. Things change. And for countries that have a written constitution, particularly if, like in America, their constitution is stacked to the rafters with idealism, this can be a problem. A great example is something called the Second Amendment, a particularly concise bit of the US Constitution that states the following. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. At the time of its adoption, this amendment made a great deal of sense for a whole bunch of reasons. The chief one being that back in the day, America was a pretty wild place. It was a frontier nation. With frontier nations, you get problems like untamed wilderness, roving banditry, and of course bears. However, in America's case, there was also the additional concern about the continent's original inhabitants. These guys, let's just say they were less than thrilled with their new neighbours' expansionist tendencies, so it paid to have a body of armed men kicking around at a local level. Also, America didn't have much of an army back then, so if anything did go wrong, it would be the militia who would have to pick up the pieces. Also, the Founding Fathers saw militia as the best defence against a tyrannical government. So with this in mind, the Second Amendment was ratified so that the people of America would be able to arm themselves in case of a wayward government or some sort of external threat. Fast forward a couple of hundred years though, and it's pretty clear that things are different these days. For one, unless you consider a strip mall to be a frontier, America is no longer quite as wild as it once was. On top of that, the problem with the neighbours seems to have been solved with a liberal application of genocide. Number two, if there's one thing that America isn't short of, it's cops and soldiers. And finally, number three, having been largely replaced by the National Guard, militias have gone from being the true defenders of liberty and freedom to the last resort of cranks, crackpots, and kooks. So if this rule seems pretty redundant, how come they haven't ditched it? Well, as we mentioned last time, it's hard to change the US Constitution. You need 2/3 of a majority in both of the houses and then 3/4 of all the states in the Union to agree, and that's a pretty tall order. It's also a big problem with written constitutions in general. They're very hard to change, and history has this habit of turning yesterday's cherished values into today's horribly awkward historical anachronisms. On top of that, one of the strengths of the US Constitution, the fact that it's so concise and that it sums up the spirit of a nation so well, is also a bit of a drawback because it had to be written with a certain level of vagueness involved. I mean, the Founding Fathers were smart enough to know that when you're building a nation, it pays to be a little baggy. Let's take a look at the full text of the Second Amendment again. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That's all there is to it. That's literally the whole thing, just one sentence which says that states are allowed a well-regulated militia and that these militias are allowed to be armed. End of. Except that it isn't really the end of anything because you can quibble over numerous points in that sentence. For example, does it mean that a militia is an official body sanctioned by the states? Or is it just a group of pals with a dress code and some vague mission to protect the state, or whatever that might be? Let's say for a minute, though, that you're not really concerned about militias at all. You couldn't really give two hoots about them. But you are very much bothered about whether you have the right to own a gun or not. In that case, all you need to do is focus on the last 10 words. The right of the people to keep and bear arms. Now, I don't know whether the Founding Fathers were trying to enshrine the notion that the state needed militia to defend it, or whether the whole nation should be tooled up to the absolute nines. But one thing's clear, no one else does, and that makes legislating anything about gun control in America into an expensive, costly, and difficult legal nightmare. As I mentioned last time, legislating is pretty easy in Britain if you've got Parliament behind you. Basically, if you've got the votes in Parliament and you've got a law, and that law is then considered to be part of the Constitution. In America, it's different though. Any law you propose is liable to be pored over by an army of lawyers, some of whom are liable to say, hold on a sec, this sounds suspiciously like it might be breaking Amendment X or Article Y of the Constitution. Should this happen and the courts are willing to hear the case, your law is in the hands of a judge and how they interpret the relevant part of the Constitution. Given that the Constitution is so hazy on pretty much everything, that's an awful lot of power in the hands of not very many unelected people, not to mention the fact that it just gums up the lawmaking process and makes legislating on anything even remotely controversial into an expensive, time-consuming Shangri-La for lawyers. Here we find one of those weird, perverse byproducts of our unwritten constitution, in that despite the fact that it runs into thousands and thousands of documents, it can move with the times in a way that nothing else can, bar a one-party state or an absolute monarchy. Let's say, for example, that something terrible's happened and it requires immediate legislation. No problem. We can turn that around tomorrow, providing we've got the votes. Let's say that we discover, for example, that some old law is being used in a way that it wasn't intended. Well, then get the hell out of here, old law. You're through. You see, our unwritten constitution has a really, really powerful undo button in it. It's got the best control Z out of all the political systems out there. And it never ceases to amaze me how this 800-year-old nag can run rings around most written constitutions. Now, that's not to say it's all rosy. The power that comes with that unwritten constitution means that we need to be constantly vigilant that a government doesn't grow too big for its boots and starts abusing its power. However, by and large, the system works. So it's game, set and match to the British Constitution then? Well, not quite. You see, the American system does have its merits, but more importantly, it works in their historical context. I mean, if you think about it, it would have looked pretty lame if after the revolution, the Founding Fathers just turned around and said, do you know what? Let's just leave everything unchanged. Let's do everything exactly the same as our tyrannical overlords did it. That would kind of negate the point of a revolution. And it's here when you really begin to see just how unique the British Constitution is, because nearly every constitutional settlement in the world is the result of some massive seismic political shift. They tend to be the result of either becoming independent from another country or of a revolution. In Britain, though, our story's been very, very different. It all comes down to the fact that the British don't really do revolutions. We had a good stab at one with the Civil War, a conflict that led to the monarchy being abolished for a good 12 years, along with a little regicide. But in the end, we decided that actually, we rather like the old system, and wouldn't it be nice if we restored the monarchy to its original position? Then we had the Glorious Revolution, but this turned out to be much less of a pitchforks braying mob type affair, and more of a gentleman's agreement where we simply traded one unpopular domestic monarch for a far more flashy and palatable foreign one, whilst the underlying system of government remained unchanged. What this means is that we've never had that year zero scenario in Britain. We've never had that moment where we've had to wipe the slate clean and start again from scratch. Instead, our political history is a story of a tussle between the power of the monarchy on the one hand and the will of the people as expressed through Parliament on the other. Now, this tussle has been conducted within a framework of rules that allows an awful lot of bending without the risk of breakage, and that's the real beauty of the British Constitution. Despite its weirdness, despite the fact it's sometimes barely comprehensible, despite its absurdity, it has managed to outlast every other constitution on earth, and it still surprises me a day just how agile it can be. All right, so that's it on the Constitution. Thank you very much for watching. I've been Jack from Noobminster. I should be back next time. We'll be starting something different. I'm not quite sure yet. It might be the monarchy, it might be Parliament, it might be the separation of powers, but oh my God, isn't this exciting? Subscribe or die.